All right, we made it to the final video of lesson 1, right? And remember, this is intended to be a code along demo, so you can follow the steps that I'm taking and kind of code along. You might have to stop, pause, and troubleshoot some errors, but remember, those are good things, good learning opportunities. I may have some errors myself. But let's see, I might start by clicking on this DB download link in the lesson 1 page here. It should open up a new tab. I've put a file of a SQLite database out there in OneDrive, and eventually as it plugs through here, everybody should be able to get here and see that there is a SQLite file, and I'm going to press the download button just to get it locally before we take the next step, right? So you'll have to remember where your downloads go and whatnot, but hopefully we can all get that file downloaded. If I can close that once I've downloaded it, come back here. I mentioned the tool we're going to use is this SQLite DataViz tool. It's a browser-based tool, but it really doesn't run with the internet. It kind of all runs locally. I did bring up our first whiteboard of this lesson, and just to point out, we're kind of in this spot over here, right? We just downloaded a SQLite database. The next thing we're going to do is open up this tool locally, this tool that allows us, again, to write queries and run them and then see the results. But we'll import the SQLite database that we just downloaded right into that tool. So even though it kind of comes from a website, it does actually all run locally, right? So, that's why I have it drawn outside of the cloud here. But without further ado, let's come back here. We're going to press the SQLite DataViz tool. It opens up in a new tab. You can do drag and drop. It talks about that, but I like to just click here, right? So we can just click anywhere on this picture and it will prompt me to open up a file. It does take comma separated value files or SQLite files, right? So the file we just downloaded is, it's probably in my downloads folder. I probably have multiple copies of it here, but you can see today I downloaded this ATI SQL 0101 SQLite file. So let's get that opened in our tool of choice. This particular database for lesson 1 just has a single table in it. And guess what? It's named customers, right? So I'm kind of orienting us to the tool here. On the left, we can see that we've imported a database and there's a single customers table in it. If I expand that, you can kind of see these are the columns. If I went way back even to the Excel table that we kind of used for our whiteboard, it had an ID column, an L name, an F name, and a state. The ID column is a number or a real number. SQLite calls them reals. And L name, F name, and state are text. Most tools have a way for you to browse databases and tables. I've found, though, that they all do it a little bit different, some better than others. Oftentimes, I'll collapse that. I also try to eliminate distractions and only work on queries, right? So maybe I'll collapse that and try not to use that so much, even though no, it's there and you could certainly incorporate that into your habits. But in the main workspace here is where we write queries. And there are no queries, so we have to press this create button to create our initial query, right? And then we kind of get the two panes like I mentioned, a place where we can write SQL and a place where we'll see our results, right? And this play button will be how we get the results for our SQL, right? So if I just Alt-tabbed back to our SQL whiteboard, the first one we're going to type in is this one. It'll even be on line 1 as I wrote on the whiteboard. But select star all the columns from customers, the table that we know exists in this database, right? So I'm going to do select star from customers, put a semicolon. Not sure that it's necessarily needed, but it's good practice. And then I'm going to press the play button to run this SQL query, right? I'll draw an arrow there before I actually press it. And sure enough, we see the same data that we had seen from Excel, right, on our whiteboard. But again, this star means all columns of data. In this case, it meant ID, L name, F name, and state. And it gives me all rows because I don't have a where clause. One thing I didn't talk about on the whiteboard, because it's not necessary because we don't run the queries, but A comment is 2 hyphens or 2 minus signs or dash dash, and I always put a space after it. Notice it turned gray. If I tried to run the query now, there is no query, right? So there's nothing returned. But I said I want to do our second query that we had on the whiteboard. So instead of selecting star, all columns, I want to select specifically first name or F name and L name, first name and last name. And notice that's a different order than they exist in the table, right? So let's try that. So I'm going to say select F name, and then we have to comma separate these columns, L name, but then we put our from clause, and we say from customers, and we put a semicolon. I'm going to come over here and press the play button. And sure enough, notice I don't get ID or state, right? I just get F name and L name, right? And it's in a different order than they came back if we ran the first query, right? Because it goes ID, last name, or L name, F name, and then state. That was kind of cool. In that second query, we added a where clause. So I'm going to keep going on one line here, but I'm going to say where. I know there is a state column, so I can say where that column named state, it has values equal to WI. And notice I put WI, since those columns, since state is a text column, we have to make comparisons using a single quoted WI. So rather than seeing all three of these, I think we'll lose Suzanne Smith because she was not in Wisconsin. So let's press the play button and see. So evidence that the star determines which columns come back, right? And in this case, we're just getting the F name and the L name column. And the from says which table we're selecting the data from. We'll see in future lessons that can be more than one table. It can get quite complex. But then the where clause lets us put a filter or some comparison where we'll check every row. Sometimes when I talk about this, I'll go back and let's see, I'll comment out that query. I'll put this one back and we'll kind of be, and I'll rerun it. And I can kind of be the query engine that applies this where clause, right? Select star from customers. I'm going to look at the first row and see, oh, where state equals WI. Yes, in the first row it does. So yes, that's going to be included in my results. The second row, state equals WI. Yes, that will be included in my results. California, CA, will not be included in my results, right? So again, with 3 rows of data, we can kind of look at it and see that it works. But if you imagine if we have tens of thousands of customers, we have to trust that we're writing correct SQL, right? So I'm going to run this one more time and we're going to see it, right? So that's kind of cool. I did in the whiteboard, and I want to kind of end here by saying, I prefer breaking my syntax up a little bit, right? And all tools, some tools support this as standard query formatting, or they let you pick your standard. I still sometimes just like to type it in that way, right? Because it makes me think about what I'm doing. So, and I'm just going to retype this one, and then we'll do some examples as to why I might do it this way, right? So I'm going to say select on a line by itself. Sometimes I'll put a space after it because you might get some code completion. So I'm doing select space, enter. I'm going to put a couple of spaces for indentation. And I'm going to say, well, if I keep it like the one above, F name, I put a space at the end. Again, SQL ignores white space. So spaces at the beginning and the end don't matter. It lets me format it so it's readable. We'll also select L name. I know it's a little bit weird there that comma is in front, but you'll see why in a little bit. I go outdent and I put from. Our table is still customers. And our where clause, and I would back that all the way up. So even I didn't quite type it correctly there, indented correctly. And I'll say where state is equal to WI, right? My last thing is I'll probably put a semicolon at the end, right? So this is the way I would type the SQL. If I press run, it looks identical. One of the reasons I do this leading comma is I might do something like this. I want to select first name and last name, but what are my other columns on there? Sometimes I'll put a comma star there. So again, I'm just adding something to my select clause. Again, select statement has a select clause, a from clause, and a where clause. Right? It has other clauses that we'll learn in future lessons, but here I added a whole line 8 that says select star. If I run that, you can kind of see, yeah, I get F name and L name, which come from these two lines, but then I get all the rest of the columns again. I get that star, all the columns, right? And sometimes that's useful. If there are hundreds of columns, I might scroll left or right and find, oh yeah, I want F name, L name, and state, right? So then I would come over here, see that state was there, and then I might, when my query's done, or if I want to make it the results less noisy, with that leading comma, I can just put a little comment in front of that one line, and now I'm just going to get 3 columns, F name, L name, and state. Right? The other reason for one item per line, and I'll demonstrate this in SQLite and then I'll show it in one other tool, but if I were to misspell a column name, like I forgot my E there on L name, right? I'm getting some code completion that says, hey, you probably mean L name, but if I press run, I get no such column L name without the E exists, right? Many database tools will actually tell me what line number that's on, and it would say it's on line 7, and then I know exactly there's only one thing on line 7, right? So this particular database tool in SQLite doesn't, so I'm not quite benefiting from leading comma syntax as much as I like, but I still write my SQL this way, right? Because if I forgot the S in customers, say in that query, it would just say error on line 3. Well, my whole query's on line 3, right? So it can be more helpful, and I actually get very used to kind of squinting at this and seeing my clauses, select from where. They're color coded and they're outdented. Anyhow, you'll either learn to love or hate this syntax. Teams that you work on will either learn to love or hate this syntax as well if you start writing your SQL with it. I did want to show, I did bring up, well, first I'll jump here. Because I wanted to show that line number errors, I brought up Azure Data Studio, and I'm going to connect it to a Postgres database. Now, this part is not follow along, but if I just Alt-Tab to my Azure Data Studio running, and I can see I have select L name and F name from customers, and notice I'm getting, or F name and L name, I'm just getting those 2 columns. I wanted to show that if I took the E off on line 3 and tried to run this query, here's an example of, well, what's funny is it actually says on line 1. I know for a fact that I've done this before, and it's, so when I reran the query a second time, it actually corrected the error to say it was on line 3, right? So keeping our SQL formatted nicely, somewhat simplistically, yes, it might get very long. We might have, a 50-line SQL, but each one of those lines is easy to look at and understand, and it's possible that if we have an error on one of the lines, we only have one thing to look at rather than my entire query being on one line. Let's see, if I pop back to our tool of choice, if I were to give you some homework, it might look like this, and I'm going to put it in comments here down below, right? And I'm going to use English words, but you'll have to translate this to a select statement. Show last names and states only for all customers, right? So we're writing select statements, but I only want to see last names and states for all customers. All customers means I probably don't need a where clause, right? I want all my customers versus limiting them to where state is in Wisconsin. So that would be a fun one for you to try. Show first names of customers with last name Doe, right? Maybe this query, it has a select clause that only shows first names, so there's only one column in the select clause, but it has a where clause rather than comparing state, checks the last name column, right? And I'm using English words here. Remember, those columns have a specific name in the database, specifically L name for last name, right? But that's putting a where clause on last name to get those results. The final bit of, hey, practice this a little bit. I'd say find a CSV, a comma separated value file, and import it, right? So you could either start over in our tool. You could either start over in our tool, or if you expand this little button here, this one here is add a new table from CSV. So you could press that button and go open up your other CSV file, right? If you found a CSV file. And then it would show up here as a new table, right? So my homework is find a CSV file and import it. And then I always, whenever I get a new table, run a select star against the new table, right? And maybe the last thing I'll say is more like experiment running a few queries against your CSV table. Limit the columns. I gotta spell that correctly. Limit the columns in the select clause. In other words, you can comma delimit a bunch of different column names in the select clause, or limit the rows with a where clause, right? So if I clean this up a little bit, you have a little bit of homework, right? Really, this is just me trying to encourage you to practice, practice, practice. You'd be surprised how depthful of queries that you can write, even with this simple table with 3 rows in it, right? But I'm suggesting, hey, go find another CSV file. Maybe you have some data at work that you need to start exploring with SQL. This is a good opportunity to give that a try. So that's the end of this lesson. I hope you're learning a lot, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks.